Now, who among us doesn't love a good celebration? Because of COVID, it might have been a while since some of us attended a celebration, at least in person. But try to think back to when such events were more common in our lives. Gathering with people you love, feasting on delicious food and drink, maybe a little dancing, and definitely enjoying the company of all the revelers for whatever occasion brought you together. Today's gospel describes such an occasion, a wedding in the town of Cana in the region of Galilee. A regular old community where people raised families, worked the land, and said their prayers, mostly living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, just trying to keep things going as best they could. When it came time for a wedding celebration, well, that was something to note. The whole community would turn out, eating and drinking, dancing and laughing, all to their heart's content, for hours and even days on end, raising their glasses to life, to love, to joy, to hope, not just for the newly married couple and their families, but also to the community of Cana. May it prosper and thrive. Amen and amen. So the big day comes, the party starts, and just when things are cranking up and getting good, the unthinkable happens. Suddenly, inexplicably, the wine gives out. The wine gives out? Well, how can this be? Did the guests just simply overindulge? Did the host not order enough? Was there an accidental spill in the wine storage room that caused this catastrophe to occur? We don't know. All we know is that the wine gives out. So since wine was a central part of the culture, especially at celebrations, to have the wine give out is not simply an unfortunate inconvenience, but rather an occurrence that could bring an abrupt and embarrassing end to the whole thing. It's for this reason that reviving the wine supply was an all-hands-on-deck emergency. Now, thankfully, there was a guest present who knows a thing or two about getting things done. So Jesus and his people get to work. Operation Revive the Wine went into full effect, employing everyone from Jesus' own mother, who first called this crisis to his attention, to the servants who procured the materials needed to pull this off, to Jesus himself, who somehow, some way, made wine where there once was no wine. Because ultimately, that's what happened. There wasn't any wine, and then there was. Now, what many of us remember about this story is that Jesus turned water into wine, which he did. But to name the act of turning water into wine as the miracle of the story, as the thing that caused people to believe in him, to do that is to forget that the central problem in the story was that there was no more wine. This is what sent everyone into a frenzy to remedy. Only once they had wine was the crisis over. So it seems like actually the miracle of the story, the thing that caused people to believe in Jesus, is less about the water becoming wine and more about the no wine becoming tons of wine. Technical term there, tons of wine. Wine was refilled. Wine was replenished. Wine was restored. Wine was revived. And in turn, the wedding itself was reinvigorated, reinstated, redone, redeemed. There are lots of R words that we could use to describe what happened at the party, including one that might not be as obvious as the others, but I think gets at the heart of the story. And that is the word resurrection. Resurrection. Now, I know Resurrection is usually a term we reserve for stories about the dead being raised, and mostly in reference to what happens to Jesus at Easter. But I want to invite us to expand our definition of resurrection stories to include ones where something clearly isn't as God intended it to be, and so God steps into the breach and sets things right. Stories where lack becomes plenty and longing is satisfied, where the broken is restored and the empty is filled, where the forsaken are redeemed and the lost are found. Anytime there is movement from one of these states to another, that is resurrection, including, I would suggest, a movement from no wine to tons of wine, when wine represented much more than just a nice drink to have at a party. So, are you still not ready to read this as a resurrection text? Stay with me. Let's have a look at what I hear as our first clue. It's the opening phrase of the passage. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. On the third day. Now, at first read, we might just assume that this story takes place within a linear progression of days, two of which must have been mentioned in the previous verses. But when we look at those previous verses, that simply is not the case. The phrase "the next day" is used 3 times in the story right before today's reading, which should make today's reading start with the phrase "on the 4th day," if in fact the day they're referencing is the next one in the storyline. So "on the 3rd day" must serve some other function besides just connecting this story to the previous one. Now, on the 3rd day, it does sound familiar. I know I've heard it somewhere before. Oh yes, they will hand him over to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the 3rd day he will be raised. The Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day, rise again. But God raised him, say it with me now, on the 3rd day, and allowed him to appear. On the 3rd day is the phrase most often used in the New Testament to describe the time of Jesus' resurrection. And that phrase is also used throughout the Old Testament in stories where lives are saved, sickness passes, wounds are bound up, or the Lord's presence is revealed in a place. All of these are examples of that movement I mentioned before, moving from the state of not life to being firmly in the state of life. So on the 3rd day has clear resurrection undertones in just about every instance it's used. Now, after hearing all this, I wonder if we're ready to add resurrection to the list of R words that describe what happened at this wedding in Cana. And even more than that, I wonder if we're ready to use this R word to shape the way we read the story so that more than anything, it becomes a story of resurrection. A story of resurrection that we notice is very close to the beginning of John's gospel. We're just 2 chapters in. We know that good storytellers often introduce their major themes towards the beginning of their writings so that readers get a clue about what they're supposed to pay special attention to. The author of this gospel is no different. John used this tactic in his storytelling too. So since John situates this resurrection story very close to the beginning of the gospel, we can assume that he wants us to see that the theme of resurrection is going to come up a lot in his gospel. Certainly in the resurrection of Jesus, but also in lots of other stories. Stories like today's of no wine to tons of wine, and in the healing of a paralyzed person, in the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus gives sight to someone born blind, and when he raises Lazarus from the dead. In each of these stories, there is a movement from no life to life through some kind of restoring, replenishing, reviving, or renewing. So clearly, John wants us to see and know that this is what God is about. Or in other words, John clearly wants us to see and know that the primary work of God is resurrection, especially in the midst of pain, fear, want, doubt, or death. The primary work of God is resurrection. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I see that in these Bible stories, but what does that have to do with me? And this is where the rubber meets the road, right? If we can't see God's resurrecting work in our own lives, what good are these stories? I love these stories, and I've dedicated my life to reading and studying them. But these stories are not the sole reason I believe that God's resurrecting work extends beyond the Bible. I believe God's resurrecting work extends beyond the Bible because I've experienced it in my own life. As a child growing up in a family marked by addiction, as a young mother going through a divorce, years ago when my vocational hopes were dashed, and as recently as last spring when my precious father died unexpectedly. During each of these times, all I could do was fight against the darkness, push against the despair, and wonder when and if a resurrection might come. And then time and time again, slowly, gradually, the light would start to break in and the hope would start to return as the resurrection did, in fact, appear. Perhaps even more convincing than my own lived experience with this is the number of times that I've seen it happen in your lives. I've sat and cried and prayed with so many of you in your own struggles, with addiction, with divorce, with vocational loss, with death. I've seen you fight against the darkness, push against the hopelessness, and wonder when and if your resurrection might come. And then time after time, slowly, gradually, I've watched the light start to break in and the hope start to return as your resurrection did in fact appear. Now, I know that some of you are still deep in the struggle. You're truly wondering when and maybe if a resurrection will come for you. Hear this. You don't have to be in that place alone. Let us sit there with you. Let us cry and pray and hold our breaths while we wait together for the light, for the hope, for your resurrection to appear. This is how resurrection always works. It's collective and it's collaborative. Even Jesus didn't do the wine thing by himself. Now, I asked at the beginning who doesn't love a good celebration, and I'll end by asking who doesn't love a good resurrection? I think we're due for more than one right about now. As this pandemic rages on and political leaders fight, and every day seems to bring a whole new set of struggles. So let's keep our eyes open and our hearts tuned, lest one shows up where we're not expecting it, at somewhere, say, like a wedding. Amen.